Hello, this is the sermon for the second Sunday of Easter, April 12th, and the texts are 1 Peter chapter 1 verses 3 to 9 and John's Gospel chapter 20 verses 19 to 31. One of the mantras of our culture is seeing is believing. And even though the risen Jesus in our story from John's Gospel says, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe," it must be said that the story plays into seeing is believing to some degree. In the past, I have given Thomas a hard time for not believing the testimony of his fellow disciples. But to be fair, all he wants is the same experience that they have had, to be in the presence of the risen Jesus. It also turns out that Thomas's doubt is part of a pattern in John's Gospel. The pattern is that first, someone receives testimony about Jesus. Second, that person receives the testimony with skepticism. Then, Jesus appears to that person and convinces them by his presence. This pattern repeats itself with the encounter with Nathanael in the first chapter of John's Gospel, with the Samaritan woman at the well in the fourth chapter, and it may be said with both Mary Magdalene and the disciples with their first encounters with the risen Jesus, as we heard today. Thomas, it turns out, is no different than these. The other disciples testify about Jesus to him, saying, "We have seen the Lord." But Thomas receives their testimony with skepticism, saying, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands, and put my finger in the mark of the nails and my hand in his side, I will not believe." Jesus appears to Thomas and the other disciples, inviting Thomas to do just as he said he wanted to do. In response, Thomas is convinced, confessing, "My Lord and my God." Thomas's experience is part of a pattern in John's Gospel. And since the presence of Jesus to convince is also part of the pattern, it plays into the seeing is believing mentality. Even though as Christians we profess that there are unseen realities, we might still unknowingly buy into the seeing is believing mentality. This can happen through something called practical atheism. What that is the habit of making decisions and choices based on what is evident only to the senses, whatever the individual making such decisions may believe about unseen realities. Even though we may profess that there is a spiritual reality that is not visible to the senses, the realm of God, we may be guided not so much by the values of that realm, as we are by the values instilled by a culture of seeing is believing. For all intents and purposes, we may as well act as if the spiritual reality we claim to believe in simply does not exist. I have said before that we are able to experience the presence of the risen Christ in prayer and during worship. But that might not be enough, because such experiences rely on our willingness to be influenced by an unseen reality. And if we are acting according to a seeing is believing mentality, then we are not open to the spiritual reality that is the realm of God. Of course, this difficulty can be lessened if we are blessed with a vision of the risen Jesus, but such an experience tends to be restricted to a blessed few. I have not been graced with a vision of Jesus, and I would imagine that you have not been either. So that puts us in a difficult spot. We desire to be guided by the values of the realm of God, but in spite of that desire, we may well act as though it does just come down to seeing is believing. Prayer and worship may open us to a spiritual reality, but we may still not be influenced by that spiritual reality as we would like to be if we have fallen into the habit of practical atheism. Fortunately, there is a way out of this impasse. In our passage from the first letter of Peter, it says, referring to Jesus, "Although you have not seen him, you love him, and even though you do not see him now, you believe in him and rejoice with an indescribable and glorious joy, for you are receiving the outcome of your faith, the salvation of your souls." At first glance, this does not seem to get us out of the predicament we may find ourselves in. We may well profess that we do indeed love Jesus, but if we are guided by practical atheism, our love for Jesus may not make much difference in our day-to-day lives. This is a problem until we remember the words of the first letter of John, where it says, "Those who do not love a brother or sister whom they have seen cannot love God whom they have not seen. The commandment we have from him is this: those who love God must love their brothers and sisters also." What that means is that in order to love Jesus, we must first love those whom God has given to us to be our neighbors. For as the great commandment which Jesus taught says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. And you shall love your neighbor as yourself." Love of neighbor translates into love of God. In a sermon entitled "The Weight of Glory," author C.S. Lewis says that, "Next to the Blessed Sacrament, your neighbor is the holiest thing presented to your senses. Especially," he adds, "if that neighbor is a Christian, for then Christ, although hidden, is present in the person of that neighbor." We might say that the risen Christ is present to us in any one of our neighbors, and as we know from the parable of the Good Samaritan, anyone could be our neighbor. That is to say, we can learn to love Jesus and to be guided by the values of the realm of God the more we learn to love our neighbor. We become more able to love God, whom we do not see, the more we love our brothers and sisters, whom we do see. In a way, we can overcome the habit of practical atheism and escape the mentality of seeing is believing, even without necessarily experiencing the presence of the risen Christ in prayer or worship, simply by loving our neighbor. For by loving our neighbor, we love God also. This makes the things we do to reach out in loving service to our community all the more important. For by these means we love God by loving our neighbor. The recent performance of Dreamweaver that we put on in Chesterville in support of the Faith Pantry is an example of the kind of community outreach that demonstrates love of neighbor. Such things as these are practical ways of showing love to our neighbors, and by doing so, showing love toward God. So I encourage you to continue to love your neighbor as yourself, for in that way you are indeed being guided by the values of the realm of God. And in receiving your neighbor with love, you are also receiving the risen Christ. Being in the presence of a neighbor to whom you are showing love is a way of being in the presence of the risen Jesus, a way of experiencing God that is visible to the senses.